Money in Motion is a discussion about taxes and the future. Its purpose is to gain an understanding of what you predict that future to look like for you and your family. During this discussion, it will likely become obvious that this tool was put together with a particular frame of reference in mind. However, our opinion doesn't really matter. What we hope to accomplish with this tool is to paint a vision of the future so that you can react to it and give us an opportunity to better understand your point of view. At the end of this discussion, you'll have an opportunity to share your feelings about the topics that we are about to go over. Feel free to agree or disagree with anything that you hear, as any way you respond will help us get to know you that much better. Money in Motion starts with a timeline. This timeline represents a typical American's lifespan, starting at birth, ending at death, and with a lifetime of experience in between. If all goes according to plan, at some point along that timeline, we make a decision to change our lifestyle. We used to do one thing every morning when we woke up, now we do something different. That's really the only definition that we want to give to retirement for the purposes of today's discussion, since the word retirement means so many different things to different people. If we were to graph an average person's income along this timeline, it would look something like this. During the first few years of life, we don't earn much money. Then, at some point, we get our first job, maybe a paper route or bagging groceries. And over time, our incomes increase with better jobs and pay raises. Then, often just as the income graph begins to take on a nice upward slope, and it tends to reach its highest point, we often make that decision to change our lifestyles. While this is a pretty basic financial scenario, it is worth starting our discussion here, because this financial life cycle forms the basis for the most classic method of retirement planning. That method is needs-based retirement planning. The underlying principle of needs-based planning is this. If one were to measure their income level right before retirement and call that 100% of pre-retirement income, then one can determine their retirement income need based on a percentage of that number, usually estimated at approximately 70% of pre-retirement income. While this planning framework has proven very helpful for many people, there are two basic shortcomings associated with this method of planning. One is somewhat semantic, while the other is very serious. The first shortcoming is that it can be very difficult for many people to work long and hard only to retire on what they need versus what they want. Now, this is not a statement of greed. In fact, it's just the opposite. A person can have a lot of charitable intent, but without the means by which to deliver that charity. They are either unable to act on their desires, or they do so to their own detriment. What most folks need in order to survive in retirement is food, shelter, clothing, and transportation of some kind. And while a one-bedroom apartment and a pair of bicycles may check all the required boxes, there are relatively few people for whom that sounds like a successful retirement. Instead, most would prefer to work towards a retirement that plans around their retirement wants versus their needs. Which brings us to the second shortfall. The simple needs-based approach to retirement planning often starts with a 70% income replacement ratio as a rule of thumb. Unfortunately, for many, that rule of thumb has proven to be a difficult budget line to manage. On May 12, 2007, the Wall Street Journal published an article citing a study from earlier that same year by Fidelity Research. What that and other studies showed was that 2 out of 3 respondents who took part in the study indicated that their retirement expenses either stayed the same or that they actually increased in retirement. What this indicates then is that the 70% rule of thumb should likely be, at a minimum, more like 100% of pre-retirement expenses. For many, this is a very different version for their retirement, and many ask, where do those kinds of numbers come from? The answer is that it can come from any number of sources. It seems that before retirement, many people work hard to pay off the mortgage. And in retirement, they may buy the cottage, vacation home, or hunting land that they always wanted. Before the change in lifestyle, they may have driven an old car that they nursed along to get the most out of it that they could. Then in retirement, it finally gives up the ghost to be replaced by a new car designed to last throughout their planned retirement. During the earning years, a family vacation may have been a long weekend at a water park, but in retirement, a person may finally have the opportunity to go abroad. During the first part of life, money gets spent on the kids, and during retirement, money gets spent on the grandkids. Today, many people enjoy health care that is partially paid for by their employer. Later on, we find that more and more of our health care expenditures come from our own pockets. Now, given that 2/3 of the people surveyed are spending at least 100% of their pre-retirement level, it would seem to make sense to consider challenging a 70% income replacement target, or else we run the risk of not having enough savings 2 times out of 3. Okay, I'd like you to make a mental note about income replacement so that we can come back to it later, and I'd like to introduce a new topic. I have a question for you that I'd like you to answer from the pit of your stomach. In the future, say 5, 10, or 20 years from now, do you think tax rates will be higher, lower, or the same as they are today? This chart shows the top marginal tax rates for married couples filing jointly from 1916 to 2011, as well as the top tax rates for both corporate income and capital gains. And while there have been some modifications to the capital gains tax, these rates have remained largely unchanged in 2012 and 2013. When you look at the top marginal income tax rate in green, which topped out at over 90% in the 1940s and stands at 35% today, would you expect that future rates are likely to be different? If so, in which direction do you think they will go, up or down? In our experience, most believe that tax rates will be higher in the future than they are today, and that expectation has a significant impact when it is applied as a planning assumption. Imagine 2 families that are alike in almost every way. They live in the same town, go to the same school, attend the same church, and even have the same friends. They are identical in every way except one. The family on the left earns $100,000 a year, and the family on the right earns $200,000. We need to understand that the family on the right pays a larger percentage of their income in federal income tax because they both pay the same tax on the first $100,000, but the family on the right pays a higher tax rate on the second $100,000. This is due to a difference in their tax brackets. We'll come back to these families in a moment, but I want to discuss another relevant assumption that has an impact on how we must plan for the future. This assumption also starts with a timeline. In this example, it begins in 1975 and goes through 2005, a 30-year stretch. This is a conversation about the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is simply a measure of inflation used to gauge price increases year over year. The way that the CPI works is that it measures a market basket of goods. If you buy $100 worth of goods in 1 year, then buy an exact copy of that basket 1 year later, if it costs $102, then you've just determined that there was a 2% inflation from the first year to the next. It's worth noting that most CPI indexes and calculations exclude energy costs due to high volatility. So here's a question for you. Imagine a $100 market basket of goods in 1975. How much would you guess that market basket would cost in 2005? The answer is roughly $351. So here's what we must think about when it comes to planning in the future. If the cost of living can increase more than 3.5 times over 30 years, is it possible that over 20 years it may double? If so, we need to determine how a family like yours might be affected. Let's go back to our first timeline and take a look at a family that is approximately 20 years away from retirement. If you are a $100,000 family now, can you see how, if inflation causes your income to double over the next 20 years, you will have become a $200,000 family at retirement? In that scenario, can you see how you went from being family A to being family B, and what that would do to your tax bracket? Okay, here's an example of how these concepts come together. Let's say you have $5,000 to save for retirement and you decide to put away all of your money in traditional pre-tax savings options. Assuming a marginal tax rate of 25%, putting $5,000 into your traditional IRA or 401k will save you $1,000 in federal income tax in the year you put it away. Over the next 20 years, let's assume that money grows to, say, $20,000 when you decide to take it out in retirement. Now, here's the critical planning question. What is your tax position at that time? For most, they believe that top marginal tax rates will likely be higher than they are today, and that it's possible that they may be in a higher bracket based on inflationary pressure. We also need to understand what happens to a person's tax deductions over time. Back when you made those tax-deferred contributions, you may have done so married, filing jointly with dependents. When you withdraw the money in retirement, however, you're doing so with zero dependents, assuming that any children have been launched as successful adults. Should a spouse pass away between the time that you invest your savings and the time that it's withdrawn, then the surviving spouse may be filing a single tax return. What happens from a tax perspective if either or both of those conditions apply to you? If you find yourself in this situation, it's likely that you may look back into the past and wish that you had paid tax on some of that money at lower rates when you had more deductions. It's for this reason that we stress the importance of tax diversification when it comes to retirement planning, as well as portfolio diversification, which we'll discuss next. The Needs-Based Planning School developed another rule of thumb that can be very valuable when it's understood and applied correctly. You may or may not have heard about the rule of thumb that says that if you think of your entire portfolio, retirement money, savings, real estate, everything, as a single pie chart, you can divide that pie into two pieces: aggressive assets designed to pursue maximum returns over time, and conservative assets designed to provide steady returns that do not fluctuate much in any given year. Many investors use some sort of age-based formula to determine how much of each type of asset to have. For example, a 45-year-old would keep 45% of his or her portfolio in conservative investments, leaving the balance of 55% in relatively aggressive holdings. However, in this example, age is really a proxy. What should really determine your asset mix is a combination of factors that take your risk tolerance and time frame into account. However, what this simple example does demonstrate clearly is that the closer in time you get to your savings goals, the more conservative your assets should become. So looking at the simple age-based example, if we were to sit down together 10 years from now, we would expect to see an asset mix more like this. My hope is that the underlying concept of the closer we get to needing the money, the more defensive we should be with it makes sense. And if it makes sense in the context of retirement savings, it should also make sense when applied to our college savings goals. Now, with all that being said, the real question is, how do you feel about this discussion?